Welcome to episode 55 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourScreenplay.com. In this episode's main segment, I'm interviewing Nunzio DeFilippis. He's a teacher at the Los Angeles branch of the New York Film Academy. We have a detailed talk about Transmedia, which is something that Nunzio specializes in and teaches at the New York Film Academy. Before I did the interview, I was a bit worried about talking about Transmedia. When I hear people talk about it, it often is in terms that I don't think are all that helpful to beginning screenwriters. But Nunzio has a great perspective on it, and I think there are great action items for screenwriters at virtually every level of their career. So stay tuned for that. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast. I'd like to thank over on YouTube. I'd want to thank John, Rachel, Stanford Crane, and Ginger Shine, who left me nice comments on episode 53. Thank you guys for that. I always look at these comments, so if you have a question or a comment about this episode, please don't hesitate to leave it over on YouTube. YouTube has a nice commenting system, so it's easy for me to respond to questions and comments. Thank you everyone who subscribed to my YouTube channel in the last week as well. I'm pushing close to the 550 subscriber mark, so that's exciting to see it growing nicely. If you use YouTube a lot, please do consider subscribing to my channel. And on Twitter, it's not that easy to look through my notifications and figure out who tweeted the episode last week, but I do really appreciate all the retweets. There's a lot of stuff in the notifications window that's not retweets. There's a lot of favorites and retweets to older episodes, and there's a lot of stuff where people they seem to just put my handle in their tweets, not even really having anything to do with my own Twitter tweets or anything else. They just put my handle in there almost just to get me to look at their stuff. So it's just sort of difficult to figure out who actually retweeted the episode and thank those people individually, but I really do appreciate it. I do try and answer all questions that people send me via Twitter, so if you use Twitter, please do feel free to drop me a question and I will respond to it. And over on Facebook, thank you Charlie Desai, Christy Rich, John Giannopoulos, Raymond Hartwell, and Joy Nowak, who all liked the SYS Facebook page last week. Again, I do try and answer any and all questions that I see come through there. So if you have a question, feel free to post it on Facebook and I will respond to it. You can find our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/sellingyourscreenplay. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts, and then just look for episode number 55. Also, if you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide: how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm talking with screenwriter and screenwriting teacher Nunzio DeFilippis. Here is the interview. Welcome, Nunzio, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's fun to talk about writing because it's such a solitary life.
Yeah, that's true. So to start out, I wonder if you can just give us a quick overview of your career, kind of how you got into the entertainment industry and what you've done to get to the point that you're at now.
Well, I have been a writer my whole life. Wrote a story when I was in the 6th grade about my dog having superpowers, and my parents decided that's it, he's a writer. And despite their repeated attempts to steer me away from that to science, I kept coming back to it. But really the decision, because I was a psych major in college with a minor in film, the decision was at grad school. I moved out here to Los Angeles and I sort of embraced the life of the screenwriter in Los Angeles when I got my my master's degree at USC. And my thesis script was optioned, and then the company that optioned it kind of fell apart for a year and got restructured. So I had a very quick crash course in how so much of what happens to you here is outside of your control. And I stuck it out. And once I knew I stuck it out past that, I knew I was going to stick it out forever. Did a couple seasons on the HBO television show Arliss. Did a few episodes of the Disney series Kim Possible. Have had numerous scripts optioned or sold story ideas and then go into development hell and disappear forever. But I got paid, so that always counts. Everything that I've done, I actually do with my writing partner, who is my wife, Christina Weir. I am the more vocal of the two, so when we pitch, I do most of the pitching. That's why I'm also doing the interviewing and most of the teaching. And that brings me to what I've done lately. The two of us have moved into comics as a way to create new story ideas and get them out there as intellectual properties. We've done superhero books for DC and Marvel, but we've also done independent comics with creator-owned material that has gone on and been optioned as television series or optioned as feature films, a couple of which are still in development right now. And the last few years, I've been teaching at the New York Film Academy in Los Angeles and just became chair of the screenwriting department on the Los Angeles campus. And that's who I am. I've sort of made a living writing or teaching writing with no other, garbage screenwriter jobs that we have to take to survive since 1999. So I've been able to make a go of it.
Yeah, great. So I wonder if we could just touch briefly. You mentioned the option to, I think you said Hollywood Pictures when you're in grad school at USC. Yes. Just quickly, how did you get that option? How did you get that script to them, and how did you get it optioned?
Well, at the time, USC had a Hollywood Pictures fellowship where you would, at the start of your second year, you would develop your idea for your thesis feature script, and then execs from Hollywood Pictures would come in and listen to the students pitch the idea, and they would give feedback, and based on the pitch really and the response to the feedback, they would pick two students to have their ideas optioned. And basically you would spend the year at the school developing the script, writing it, and then at the end of the year you would submit the script to Hollywood Pictures, and they would give a fellowship that would go towards your tuition or your spending money, and however you chose to spend it in grad school. I did it towards tuition. But in exchange for that, from the day you graduated, they had a 1-year option on your script. And the principle of it was to get us our first chance out in the industry. In practice, what it meant was that the two of us who got the Hollywood Fellowship had a bit more pressure on us to deliver a script that would make the school look good, because once it was out there, Hollywood Pictures would be looking at it and judging the caliber of scripts that the entire program at USC was delivering based on two students' work. So it was a really great thing when it started. It was a pretty terrible thing by the time it was done, but the money was good, and it was a chance to get out the door. And as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, Hollywood Pictures restructured within weeks of my graduation. But the weeks before I graduated, I was pulled aside by teachers saying, "Hey, your script's not ready." And even though they felt it was better than some of my peers, not as good as some of the others, but better than some of my classmates, they didn't know what to do because they didn't want to send it out if it wasn't ready. And the only leverage they had was, well, once you graduate, it goes to them, so we can prevent your graduation, despite the fact that I was an A- kind of student. I suddenly was looking at, wait, you're going to keep me here until I get the script ready?
Wow.
And then when I asked them what was wrong with it, their response was, well, it's just not good enough. There was no feedback at all. So I went into a panic in my last 6 weeks of college. Actually, my last 3 weeks of college was when this really fell on me. Grad school, excuse me. And then I delivered it, and they said, "Oh, this is great. You can send it." Sent it, and then Hollywood Pictures closed their doors. So this wonderful option turned into a nightmare for the last few weeks of my grad school, and then didn't yield anything because the execs involved were let go during the restructuring, and the new execs didn't want to do because I went in a year later and said, "Hey, you've restructured. You had an option, but your doors were closed. I'm happy to extend the option for a year," just figuring it would get some traction that way. And they were like, "No, that's the old administration's business. Sorry."
Yeah. I'm curious. It sounds like a great program. I actually went to CSUN, and they didn't have anything like that. I got a master's degree there in screenwriting, and they didn't have anything like that. But so it sounds like a great program getting the students out there. Did any of these that you know of, did any of the scripts actually get optioned and actually get made, over the course of however many years this program was around?
To my knowledge, I don't think any film was made by Hollywood Pictures based on the fellowship, and I don't think actually right after the restructuring, I think the Hollywood Pictures Fellowship went away. I don't know that USC has a replacement for that at this time. It was a great opportunity though, and you know, in an ideal world, getting made would be the gravy, in a sense, the going in the door, getting in the door and meeting people and discussing your idea and learning how development works. That's probably the more valuable experience. That's what I wound up being denied because of the restructuring. If it hadn't been made, it hadn't been made. You know, I've been now out in the industry for, 20 years since that happened. And I've learned enough to know that we have the dream that we're going to sell right away, and that's unrealistic. If every script, if what it does is bring you a fan, a contact, then it takes you one step closer to a sale. And I think that was what was ideal about that program, was it gave us a chance to make fans in the industry, then sit down and hear what the process of development would be like, so that we would be better armed with those fans liking our work and our understanding of how to work with development execs. We would have been better equipped for that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's, you mentioned that you got recently into writing comic books. Let's just talk about that and that transition. How did you get into comics? Did you meet someone? You pitch some stories? I know there's going to be screenwriters that are definitely interested in pursuing something like that. So, how did you get into from being a screenwriter to a comic book writer?
I personally was a comic book fan my whole life, superhero comics and non-superhero comics. A little bit I knew about as a kid, but mostly I knew about superhero comics. But my friend, my college roommate, best friend, Greg Rocca, is a novelist and then a big name in the comic industry. And he started in the comic industry a few years before I did, and he got in at DC, and then he was part of the Batman team, writing Batman, and there was an event called Officer Down, and they needed someone to fill in on an issue of Officer Down, and he got me in the door on that. And I had just started writing with my then roommate, and we might have been dating at the time. We just started writing together, but she had no interest in comics. So I took this one on myself and thought of it as a sort of one-off, no big deal. Whenever an opportunity in comics arose, I would follow it. I pitched for some other things that didn't really pan out. And then Christina and I started writing another feature about a serial killer who wears the skins of his victims and becomes them. And our friend read the idea, like the treatment for it, and said this would make a great horror comic miniseries. And he was working with a small publisher called Oni Press, and he introduced us to them. And they published that and have published something from us pretty much for the last 10 to 15 years consistently. We've worked with a couple other publishers, and then through that, I got back at DC, this time with Christina as a partner, and Marvel, and we wrote X-Men and Adventures of Superman and one 4-page short for Wonder Woman and an arc of Batman Confidential. So we've written some of the bigger names, and we've sort of circulated around the superhero world, but for the most part, we've tended to use the comic industry as a place to tell our stories, our non-superhero stories, and then draw attention to them here, but really just to write the story, to get the story told.
Okay. So. Just a couple follow-up questions on that. So, I had a few comics as a kid, but I'm not really a big comic book fan. So maybe these are very newbie type questions, but when you say like a mini series, what exactly does that mean? That's like you write a mini series comic book. Is that like 8 issues? Is one?
Well, a comic itself is anything in that form of sequential art, which is, pictures told in sequence to tell a story. usually illustrated, though some people will do it with photographs, but for the most part, usually illustrated. That's a comic, but a comic book is what you see in comic stores that you used to see on newsstands when I was younger, and occasionally you'll see on the spinner racks in bookstores. The 22 pages of story, the superhero books are now down to 20 pages of story, put out monthly. So that's a comic book. The graphic novel is the larger, thicker, 150 pages, 100 pages, 250 pages, all told in one book. But a comic book is an individual issue. Now that can be an ongoing series, like a Superman or Archie or The Walking Dead, where every month a new issue comes out and it advances the story, except in the case of Archie where it tells sort of standalone stories that might build a larger, depending on which book within the Archie line you're talking about. A mini-series is meant to be done after a certain number of issues. There was a term called a maxi series for a long one, like 8 issues or 10 issues, and people don't tend to use that term anymore. So at this point, a mini-series is anything that's intended to be done. Usually it's 4 to 7 issues. It can get up to 8 or 12, 8, 10, 12 issues. And then they're often collected in a trade paperback that you see in the bookstore. Like The Watchmen, which everybody assumes is a graphic novel, was a 12-issue maxi series or a 10-issue maxi series.
And then they just compile into a bigger.
Yeah, and it's been since 1985 since The Watchmen, I believe. And so no one's ever seen it in an issue form, so everyone just assumes its natural form is that collection. But that was a miniseries. It was released monthly. It had the as a storytelling form, it had similarities to TV in that you have to, at the end of the issue, give people reason to come back and buy the next issue. The same way on a show, you have to get them to come back and watch the next episode.
I'm curious, as a writer, what does something like, if you get hired to write one episode of, you said a Batman, filled in and wrote one episode of a Batman, what does something like that pay? And again, you don't have to tell me exactly, but just ballpark, what are we talking?
Well, I don't know what the numbers would be at this point at DC and Marvel. Christina and I haven't worked for them in 5 years or so. But the way that the math works is it works as a page rate. You get paid per page, on the book, and it used to be 22 pages per issue. Now it's 20 pages per issue. So you would, let's say your page rate is $100 a page, which is a reasonable page rate at the time that we were working there. Not incredibly high, not incredibly low. So that would be for the one issue that month. That would be, now that they're 20 pages per issue, it's $2,000.
Okay. And what is the script like as a writer? How do you script something like that? Is it very much in screenplay format, and then you take that to the artist and they start to actually turn it into pictures?
Well, unlike screenplay format where there's kind of one format, down to fonts and margins, comic scripts can be any number of formats. Like there are probably as many comic script formats as there are writers writing comics. However, there are sort of categories of comic scripts. There are what they call loose scripts, and a loose script sort of tells the artist what's happening in the issue and turns over control over what page it happens on or how many panels are on a page to the artist. And so a screenplay would be a perfectly viable loose script format to write your comic in. You write a screenplay and you give it to the artist, and the artist then lays out the page. But then there's what's called a tight script or a full script, where you are writing page 1 and then you list panel 1 and you describe what's being seen in each panel and what lines of dialogue are being lettered in each panel, and you have complete control. And I think, depending on how closely you work with your artist, how much you trust your artist, you may vary from job to job how much control you have. But Christina and I tend to lean towards the full script. And one of the reasons is we get to be the director as well as the writer in that case. Is we get to decide how everything is paced and what angle we're going to be viewing things from, though a lot of that is left to the artist. You can dive into that. And so it gives you a greater understanding of the visual aspect of storytelling, which then feeds back when you're a screenwriter. So you have a better understanding of what other people will be bringing to the table as a director or as a cinematographer or as an actor.
Perfect. So, okay, so let's one of the things, let's kind of move on. One of the things we talked about via email before the podcast was the thesis workshop that your students go through that simulates the development process. I get emails from new writers all the time asking questions like, how can I make sure that I get final say over how the movie turns out? And I think a lot of people, you're laughing. But these
I have an answer. The answer is make the movie out of your own pocket.
Yeah, exactly. These people are very serious. So I think a lot of people, they don't quite understand just how subservient screenwriters really are to directors and producers. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the development process and what screenwriters can expect from it.
Well, I think that what happens in the development process is that other people bring money and talent to the table. And for that, they want to have some measure of control. And obviously, talent, if bringing talent to the table gave you control, then screenwriters would be the most powerful people in Hollywood. So there are sort of tiers of talent. And those tiers are based on who would bring money to the theater. Very few writers command a name that would bring an audience. Aaron Sorkin brings an audience. On television, Shonda Rhimes brings an audience. But for the most part, nobody says, I've got to go see that new movie written by, other than other screenwriters or people in the industry, directors, actors. They understand the process. They understand storytelling. They go, oh, if this person wrote it, if this woman wrote it, if this guy wrote it, this is a worthwhile movie. For the most part, it's, I need to go see the new movie starring these people. So actors have they bring talent, but they also bring money and recognition. And then directors, to a lesser extent, but pretty well, can bring. They can do it pretty well. They can bring an audience. You go see a David Fincher movie. Mm-hmm. You certainly go see a Steven Spielberg movie or a Francis Ford Coppola movie or Woody Allen movie.
Even on the director front, though, there's only a handful of those guys around that really command that kind of, as you said, you just named probably half of them. So
yes, but I think that the other part of it is we deal in a world of sort of imagination as writers. We conceptualize a story, and what serves the story is always what dictates what we put on the page, if we're doing it right? Mm-hmm. Character, story. Those are the two things that we're concerned with. A director has the practical considerations of production. And that is why I think the director is given a bit more say than the writer is, because when a director says, I want to do this, the studio can say, okay, how are you going to do this? A writer doesn't have to make that consideration. It's like, this is what the story requires, not this is how I'm going to get that hot air balloon for the big sequence at the end. So I think that people have to recognize that there is an interest beyond telling stories that exists in Hollywood as a business. Now, that having been said, most people who go into this business do it because they like story. So certainly if you're going to get notes from a director may be taking into account practical considerations of how they're going to produce the script. But they are as much a slave to story as we are. They see story. They see the world in story. They see the world in character. Actors, certainly. The biggest problem you'll get getting notes from actors is that their character may be more important in their head than yours. They can't see beyond their own perspective, and that's good. That's their training. They see the story through the eyes of the character that they are playing. But at the same time, they give you notes that get deeper into character than you yourself may have gone. So it's easy to see how getting notes from an actor or director can still help a story. I think what writers sometimes get scared of is everyone else in the process, producers, development execs, studio execs. They think that the only consideration those people have are the ones that I started with, which are how much is this going to cost and what decision can I make to bring more money in? And you'd be foolish to not acknowledge that that's part of their process. But if they wanted to make money, Wall Street is a much better place for them than film. Certainly, like the people who run the studio certainly are making tons of money, but the executives that you're dealing with, they're not making so much money that money is the whole thing. Fear of their job certainly motivates them more than making money, but like fear of losing their job. which sometimes means fear of doing their job. But when they do it right, they're thinking story as much as you are. They are asking questions of, why is this happening this way? How can we make it better? And so what we try to do is teach people to work within the development process, because your job as a writer isn't to write a script that nobody changes. Because if that's the case, just buy yourself a camera, make a movie for yourself, and just entertain your friends with it. And that's great. And that's a creative outlet. But if you want to make a living as a screenwriter, you're going to put your work out there somewhere. If you're an independent filmmaker who writes and directs and stars in everything you do, you're going to have to line up financing. You're going to have to secure distribution. You're going to have to take it to film festivals and get people to agree to screen it. At some point, you're going to have to pitch your idea. At some point, you're going to have to listen to people tell you why it's not working and what can make it better. So what we try to teach is, how do you sift through that process? How do you separate out the notes that are not creatively driven from the notes that are creatively driven? How do you take the notes that are not creatively driven and own them, make them a creative note? There are times that somebody will tell you, we need to do this for a reason that's got nothing to do with story. And that frustrates you as a storyteller and causes you to change your story where you don't want to. But at the same time, if you can get past why it happened and find a way to make it work in your story, it may take you in a direction you hadn't intended to go. And then you get the thrill of discovering a new take on your story. Mm-hmm. So, at the school, we try to do in their thesis process, we give them a thesis advisor and readers. And then the department chair reads out every script. And so they get a set of notes from a group of faculty. And these notes might sometimes take them where they don't want to go. Now, we don't take financial considerations in. We don't read a script and say, I'm sorry, you need to change your female lead to a male lead because no one's going to put money behind a female-driven action movie. We don't do that. Mm-hmm. But what we might say is, just know that when you get out into the world, people might want to change that.
Yeah.
We tend to, the commercial marketing decisions, we don't tend to hit the students with as these are things you have to do. We tend to red flag it. We tend to say, okay, you're trying to write a $300 million science fiction movie. Okay, but you have to understand, for it to be a $300 million science fiction movie, big money has to come to the table. And big money coming to the table means you have to make certain decisions based on what is commercially viable. Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and let's move into transmedia. That's something I know that you're big on there at the New York Film Academy. Yes. I think to start out, it's a term that I hear thrown around now quite a lot. Maybe to start, you can just define what transmedia is so that at least people have some idea of what we're talking about.
Well, transmedia, I think if you get 10 transmedia experts in a room discussing transmedia, you'll get about 50 opinions about what transmedia is or isn't. I think that there are a lot of things tied up in it, but the shortest way that I can think to describe it is taking story and content and spreading it out over multiple mediums, where each medium has a unique contribution to the world or the story that is being created. So the biggest example that you can think of is Star Wars, right? The movies tell one story, but video games, they've got the Knights of the Old Republic, which takes place thousands of years earlier. The comics initially were simply multimedia. They were just retelling the story of the movie, but eventually original stories were being told. Novels filled in the gaps between the two trilogies, or took us past the trilogy and now have been made non-canon because they're doing more movies. But even, like, people will look at transmedia and say, toys. Is that transmedia? And I would say maybe. I don't think that it makes that unique a contribution to the story. But at the same time, I saw Star Wars when I was 7 years old, which tells you how old I am. I saw Star Wars when I was 7 years old, and there are a bunch of characters whose names I only know because I bought the action figures. It's a whole lot of creatures in that cantina scene who are just, hey, that's the guy who has the hammerhead, and that's the Wolfman creature. But they have names, and the only way you were going to get it is by buying some of the merchandise. So even in its own small way, that is contributing to our understanding of the story. Now, because of things like merchandising, Transmedia can get a very bad reputation because it's just ways to monetize your story across, or your world across, multiple revenue streams.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter is, while that will be a reason that people who spend money to make money, like studios, will get involved with a transmedia idea, it's not why a writer should. A writer should because you can do something fascinating in transmedia. You can tell one part of the story over here that is its own story with a beginning, middle, and end in a screenplay form, and then over here on a web series, you can fill in the backstory of a minor character in your film or TV show, or in your comic book, you can tell us what happened 300 years ago to this family. And it doesn't have to be these big sweeping things. You can get your small family drama, and then do a web content that is the blog of one of your characters that gives us insight into why the mother or the father or the sibling is behaving this way during your small family gets together film. So the transmedia possibilities exist across big and small storytelling, despite the fact that I think most people would steer it towards large.
Mm-hmm.
We try to not, because it's film school. There's always going to be a handful of students who very rightfully say, I don't want any part of this big commercial thing. How is transmedia of any use to me? And we point them towards web series that are small in nature, like Diary of an Awkward Black Woman, or I think it's Awkward Black Girl or Awkward Black Woman, or Lizzie Bennett Diaries. Things that are character-driven web content.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think we try to teach not all of the forms, but lots of the smaller forms that form transmedia. So we give them a little bit of web series, we give them a little bit of comic book, we even give them a little bit of video game. And then we have them build what's called a franchise, which is kind of separate of transmedia, but part of it, which is building a world that can contain all of these within one. Franchise building is where, I think it scares people because they think they have to build Star Wars or Star Trek or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads me to my next question, just sort of the nuts and bolts and the practicality. So someone has this great idea that they think will work as a video game and a movie franchise and a comic book. What is it they should actually do? What's the nuts and bolts of putting something like that together? Obviously, it's a full seminar or a full semester class, but just in broad strokes, what do they need to do to kind of flesh that out into these different mediums?
Well, I think that, film school is such a gamble. It's such a shot in the dark. I'm going to acquire skills that better equip me for a career that sometimes can seem like buying a lottery ticket, right? I can write a great script and 10 things can go wrong and no one will buy it. And it's got nothing to do with the quality of the script or how well I pitched it or anything to do with me. And so you can be an overnight success after 10 years of struggle, and you wait and you wait and you wait, and sometimes you make it work with small option payments your whole life and never go further than that, but you make a good living. And sometimes you make nothing and you have to wait tables your whole life, and then somebody buys your script for, $650,000 and you're on your way. So I think that, it's such a gamble. What transmedia does is it answers your question a lot more easily because it's a lot more self-starter oriented. It is much easier to get a web series up and going than it is to get a movie made or a TV show started. Mm-hmm. Those money people I talked about earlier, they don't give up their money easily, and so they quite often wait for you to be established. So you need credits to get the opportunities that you have to get in order to get credits, and it's this sort of cycle of keeping you out. Mm-hmm. But anyone with a camera and actor friends and some time can put together a web series, and obviously there's money involved, but the money is much lower, and you can kickstart it or you can self-finance it and not kill yourself the same way you would if you wanted to make a short movie, or a feature film on your own. So I think that comic books, what we try to do in the class is get you comfortable with the form, get you writing a script, and then get you a proposal that you can take elsewhere. But again, comic books at this point, you can do a webcomic and put up a page every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And the barrier to entry is getting an artist to illustrate it for you, which is not easy, but it is much more doable than getting a film off the ground.
Mm-hmm. What would an artist charge for something like that, doing a page? I've done a lot of outsourcing in various businesses. Can you go over to India and find someone who will do it for, $5 a page?
Yes. You can do a webcomic, and the beauty of the internet is that connections are made across these art forms that span continents, that span oceans, that span the globe. And so you can turn around and you can hire an artist from the Philippines or from India, or and you can hire someone from a country whose standard of living is such that what would be a shameful thing to pay an artist here is good money there.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is you want to bring an artist who cares about your project, so you want to pay them. And as much as you think, well, I'm broke, I can't afford to pay them, you have to understand that writing a comic book script, Christina and I can write a 22-page non-superhero comic if we take a week to plot it and then like 2 days to write it, if we plotted it in intense detail. Otherwise, take a lot longer to write it. But still, you can write multiple comic scripts a month, which goes back to that Marvel or DC. If you're making $2,000 a month writing a DC book, if you get 3 books, that's $6,000 a month, and suddenly you're going, hey, that's not terrible.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to have another job. You can't, as an artist, take 3 jobs at the same time. Not if you're meeting the deadlines of a monthly comic book. Well, a webcomic lowers that barrier. If I'm writing a comic book that comes out once a month, that's 20 pages of art my artist must produce every month. If you're doing a Monday, Wednesday, Friday webcomic that posts a page every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's 3 pages a week. That's 12 to 14 at the most pages per month. So suddenly they're being asked to do a little bit less. So what you would do is you would find out what they charge per page, and it can be high and it can be cheap if you outsource.
Yeah.
But you then get your comic book up, you get it noticed. The other thing is that the comic industry is very much like the film industry. There are publishers who are like the studios or the producers or production companies that you would go to, and you would go with your proposal and some proof that you know how to write a comic. That webcomic becomes very good for that, and then they do it, and then they pay the artist and they pay you. You don't work as much on spec in comics unless you're going to self-publish. Publishers don't say, hey, let me see the first 5 issues written out of your comic. They'll look at a proposal, and they mostly just want to know if you know how to write. They don't have any interest in reading 5 issues of your comic. They might want to read 1 or 2 scenes so they know you understand the format.
Mm-hmm.
But it's even better for them if you can say, I understand the format. Take a look at my webcomic that ran for 2 months. Look how good it is. And then they say, okay, you can write, and I like this idea. So comics tend to move forward more on a pitch or treatment basis, to put it into screenwriting terms, than on a spec screenplay, which specs come and go as to whether or not it's specs or treatments that sell these days. But that's a lot of work. Whereas a comic, a proposal, you get an idea and you get possessed with that idea. You know how it is. Like when you don't need in a comic treatment in a comic proposal to map out every page of every issue. You just have to know what's going to happen in that miniseries or that graphic novel, or what the constant engine of stories is for that ongoing comic. So it becomes easier on that level to generate ideas and get them in front of people. It's the same networking. It's the same they have to know you to want to see it, but by being a smaller industry, it's much easier to get into.
Okay. So I think that gives us a good overview in terms of the comic books. I wonder if you could give us a short snippet of what a video game proposal looks like and how one might create one of those. And is that the same thing? You might try and outsource the actual video game production and
we don't have our students produce the video game itself. Instead, what we have them do is they take a class in sort of game design, which is game theory. How does storytelling in games differ from storytelling in more traditional narrative forms? Because traditional narrative, whether it be the web series or the comic or the far more traditional in film school, film or TV, is character plot driven. Games don't have to be that. I mean, Plants vs. Zombies, what's the plot there? What is that funny looking farmer who talks nonsensical sounds and guide you through the game? I guess he's a character, but it's not much. It's about goals and rewards for achieving goals. And those goals are sometimes character in the game based, but sometimes they're purely player goals. So it requires a fundamentally different approach. World still matters in games. Like, what is the world this game is taking place in? So they spend a lot of time examining games, whether it be board games, card games, live action role-playing games, anything to understand what drives people to games, what people look for in games, and what you as a creator of stories can bring to the table to create a game or a new idea. It is part of the Transmedia class so that they bring their franchise to it and say, okay, so in my web series and my comic, I've created this world in which this occurs. What within that world is explorable from game point of view? And sometimes it's pure narrative. Sometimes it's an RPG that has narrative or a shooter that has narrative. But those are big games and ambitious games for someone in film school to try and put together a proposal for. Better that they come up with an app, a little something that, you could throw together if you found the right person. But basically what they then do is they put together a proposal. This is the game. This is the type of game that it is. This is how the mechanics would work. But they don't have to put together a full game design document where they talk about, what are the resources being brought to bear? Where am I generating the artwork? Like you don't need all of that, but they need to conceive of the game in a way to say, well, this is a game for an iPad. It is a time management game, and it fits into this universe in this way. And I anticipate that the way that the time management aspect of it would work is this way. And we've had students they've actually generated graphics and say, like, this is what, like, if you click on the, they've built an idea for a Candy Crush-esque kind of game, and they've actually made the logos for the icons for the things that move around. They don't have to do that. So it depends on how into it they get. What they really need to do is conceive of a game that would fit in, and then we would point them in the right direction in terms of, okay, well, your next step would be to get that idea in front of someone who is more of a game producer, who could then help you put together a game design document.
Yeah, sure.
And the teachers for these classes are game producers, so they can do that too.
I see. Perfect. So I'm glad that some of this was clarified. But before the interview, one of the questions I wrote down was, how realistic is this? Because when I was thinking transmedia, it was more what you're saying, the video game, the comic book, and I can see how this would be very powerful. The creating the web series or the shorts and putting those online, that's actually there's no barrier to entry. And just exactly what you're saying, the comic book, so basically self-publishing the comic online could be a very powerful thing. One thing I want to just toss this at you and kind of get your reaction. One of the things I get a lot of people emailing me. They're a novelist, or maybe they've written a comic or a graphic novel, and they want to get it turned into a screenplay. And I always feel like what's happened is they've written a novel, oftentimes self-published it, gotten zero traction with it, and what they are finding is that it's very difficult to market their book. And so what they're doing is really just getting involved with another very difficult process, which is creating a screenplay and then trying to market the screenplay, get the movie made. And I feel like they're ultimately just diluting their efforts instead of doing one thing that's very hard, now they're doing two things that's very hard, and there's some dilution. If they want to be a novelist, make that novel a success. Learn how to market your novel. Learn how to build that up, as opposed to constantly saying, well, I'll create a video game and I'll create a comic book. Where do you stop? And is there some worry that might just creep into the artist?
Absolutely. The aspect of the transmedia track at New York Film Academy that I tend to teach with my writing partner wife is the comic side. So I'll put it in that term, but I think this applies to all forms: novels, games, web series. If you don't love it in the form you have it in, it's going to stink. If you are writing a comic because it is a way to sell your screenplay idea, you're going to write a terrible comic. And when you write a terrible comic, no publisher is going to be interested in it. Or if you self-publish on the web your terrible comic, no one will go to the website. And so you will do your screenplay no favors. And the same thing holds true for a novelist who turns around and goes and says, I want to create a screenplay of my novel because I haven't been able to make it work as a novel, and all I'm trying to do is get people interested in my novel by writing a screenplay. That's probably going to be a terrible screenplay. So I think that you have to, what we try to teach them is to love each form for itself, to tell a story that may be part of a transmedia franchise, but that is in and of itself suited for the form it's in, takes advantage of the form it's in, and is fun and interesting as that form. And that you as a writer are interested in doing it in that form. So I try to teach them a love of comics. You can't take a screenwriting student and say, here's a class on comic books or web series or video games. This is just another way to create an IP that will then sell your screenplay. Not gonna. It's just it's people see through that, in particular people in the individual industries. The audience in the case of the web series will respond badly to a web series that just looks like it's an advertisement for something else. But the publishers in comics are not going to respond well to, wait, so you view this thing that is my life, my passion, as just a vehicle for your screenplay?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking about video games. I don't play a lot of video games. As I mentioned, I'm not really into comic books. So for me to try and create a video game, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm sure there's a ton of subtleties that I just know nothing about. And I wouldn't have the, first idea about how to do that because I don't play video games.
Yeah, so. I think that, and one of the first steps in these classes when we teach them is we send them off to read a comic book or play some video games or watch some web series. And we encourage them to find the ones that they love. Because in all of these mediums, there are a wide range of story types, a wide range of genres. And so I think that, it's never quite as narrow as everyone believes. They go into comic books and usually they think they either presume it is superhero stories or that it's Japanese manga. And those are the two places where they sort of see it, and they forget that Road to Perdition was a comic book before it was a film, or Ghost World, or History of Violence. These were all in comic form, though Road to Perdition and History of Violence, I think, were both graphic novels, but still. The 300, though I think more people know about that. Yeah. Sin City. You can't escape it. But it's the types of stories that are out there for you are so varied in comics, and the types of video games. There's the casual games, there's the role-playing games, there's the shooting games, there's dress-up games like where all you do is you bring a little avatar around and you do activities to unlock more clothes for your character. So it can appeal to so many different types of demographics that there's probably something, I would say, for you in the video game space. There's probably something for you in the comic space. But I would say if I were encouraging you to explore those spaces, I would encourage you first to read the comics, go to a comic store and say, these are the types of movies and these are the types of novels and the types of TV shows that I like. What's there for me? And then read it and say, oh, now I get it. And the more you read it, in all of these forms, there's a language. In the same way a screenwriting student learns, there's a language to film. You can't be a good screenwriter unless you watch a lot of movies. I'm not a fan of the theory. You can't be a screenwriter unless you name a movie, put it in there. There's no movie that's so good that not seeing it bars you from being a writer. But there is a sense that if you don't watch a lot of movies, why would you write movies? And I mean, we see it actually in some of our students who, when they get to the thesis, they get a choice between creating a film or a TV show idea, where they write the pilot of the series and they write a proposal for the series, a sort of Bible that they can start to build for the series. We see students who say, well, TV is the place for writers to be now, so I'm doing that. And we say, do you actually watch TV? And they say, no, I don't. It's like, well, then you're not going to write good TV.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that, I think, extends out to these other forms.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a bit about the New York Film Academy Los Angeles chapter that you're a part of. What kind of what programs do you guys offer, and who are the ideal students for your academy?
Well, I think we offer short-term programs, and the ideal students for that are either, like if you're talking about the short-term programs that are the 8-week programs, they're fairly new to writing, and they learn about it through us, and we sort of give them the basic building blocks. The longer-term programs, or even the evening programs are for people, I think, who have jobs and lives but want to write and need a place to get feedback, both from industry professionals, working professionals, and fellow classmates, other aspiring writers or struggling writers or beginning writers. Those are what our evening classes are for. But in our long term, we offer a BFA, Bachelor of Fine Arts, and an MFA, or an associate's degree in screenwriting, or we do a 1-year screenwriting program. All of those long-term programs are designed to allow people who've never done it before to learn it, but are also built to go way deeper than someone who's already been writing has gone. Like a deeper exploration of genre. What does it mean if you're going to write a horror movie? What is it that the audience comes to expect? An examination of great screenplays and how the writers approached them and how they were a product of their time. So there's an academic element to it that then informs the very practical hands-on, which I think is what really drives our program. There's they get production elements. Even the screenwriting students are, they shoot a scene or a short in their first year, and then their second year they shoot a web series pilot if they're in the BFA or the MFA. So we make it very hands-on, and then, as we were talking about earlier, in the second year, they pick a thesis where they write either a TV pilot or a feature film, and with the pilot comes a presentation of what the series would be over time. And they get the development process. They get advisors, readers who help steer them, help them understand that when you get out into the world, other people are going to have an opinion on what you're trying to do, and how do you use those opinions to make your stories better and not resent them, yet how do you stay true to who you are as a writer and not completely change what you're writing or how you write to satisfy them, because that can be done. And so that's what the process is designed to teach. And so I think, to answer your question, what we mostly pursue, the first year is a sort of an exploration. Is this for you? If you go into the longer programs, the BFA, the MFA, or the AFA, people who are committing to the craft of telling stories, probably through film and TV, possibly through these other transmedia, which we're trying to open their minds and show them that story is story. Mm-hmm. So.
Perfect. So what's the best way for people to keep up with you and potentially contact you if they want to learn more?
We're DeFilippis. Christina's last name is Weir, Christina Weir. Okay. Mine is DeFilippis, WeirDeFilippis.com. WeirDeFilippis.com or .net. Are we .net or .com, Christina?
You know what? You can email that to me, and I'll put it in the show notes. And anybody wants to do that, I'll put it in the show notes. They can click over to it.
And we're on Tumblr as well, and on we have a Facebook fan page. And then the New York Film Academy it has a web presence which you can use as a portal to sort of explore our programs, both in the New York campus, which is where it started, and the LA campus, which is where the long-term classes tend to be on this thesis development that I was talking about. And the Transmedia is all in the New York side. On the Los Angeles side.
Perfect. I'll get all that stuff linked in the show notes. So we'll touch base via email. So you've been very generous with your time. This has been a great conversation. I know I've learned a lot. So I really appreciate your coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Just a quick plug for my email and fax blast query service. Just in the last 18 months, I've optioned 8 scripts, sold 1 script, and got 1 decent paid writing assignment. And all of this came from using my own email and fax blast query service. Here's how it works. First, you join SYS Select. Then you post your logline and query letter in the SYS Select forum. I review your logline and query letter and help you make them as good as they can be. Then you purchase the blast and I send it out for you. The emails are sent as if they're from your email address, so all replies go directly back to you. You can exclude companies if there are specific companies you don't want to send to. Just check out www.sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. Now, to wrap things up today, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Nunzio. I've talked about doing short films before. Check out episode 4 of the podcast for a detailed discussion on that. I think what Nunzio is talking about here really has some possibilities, especially for new writers. Writing a short film and then having a feature film script behind it is just a great way to potentially leverage any success that the short film has. But even if the short film doesn't take off or go viral on the internet, creating a short film like this can really help you hone your feature script and start to give you the confidence to just go out and shoot a feature film script on your own. Hopefully the main takeaway from this episode, and honestly every episode of the podcast, is that you've got to take action. You've got to do stuff and get it out into the world. If that means writing short scripts and submitting them to ads on Craigslist, do it. If that means writing a ton of feature film scripts and marketing them through my email and fax blast service, or putting them on Inktip, or putting them on the blacklist, do it. If that means shooting a short film yourself, just go out and do it. Good things can happen when you're putting stuff out into the world. Nothing can happen if you're not. And I hope that this episode just kind of gives you an idea of what the possibilities are. I mean, there's a lot of angles you can play. He mentions blogs, he mentions comics, he mentions short films. There's just a lot of ways you can potentially go out there and get your film and get your story seen. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.